Hi everyone, welcome to a new academic year and welcome to PSYB55 Introduction to Cognitive Neuroscience. It is the goal of this course to introduce you to some of the fundamental questions, theories, and methods in the field of cognitive neuroscience. So it will be my task and that of a team of very talented TAs to guide you on this journey this term. So let me start with a couple of bits of information about myself. I completed my PhD in the field of cognitive science at Brown University, followed by postdoctoral training in computational cognitive neuroscience at Carnegie Mellon University. After which I joined the faculty of the Department of Psychology at UTSC in 2013, where I've been ever since. My teaching revolves primarily around computational methods and programming techniques. I teach, for instance, Introduction to Computers in Psychological Research, this term, followed by Computers in Psychological Research Advanced Topics in the winter of 2021. I also teach at the graduate level applications of machine learning methods and techniques in various neuroimaging subdisciplines. And at the D level, I teach an undergraduate course which revolves around theories of visual recognition, such as face recognition, object recognition, reading, and so on and so forth. And these teaching interests are well grounded in my own research interests. I spend much of the time in the lab studying data and theories related to visual cognition, as well as to the development of novel neuroimaging methods, especially as related to electroencephalography and functional magnetic resonance imaging. I also have paid increasing attention to practical applications of neuroscience, especially as related to the field of neurotechnology. And all of these research activities and teaching activities are made possible by a wonderful team of graduate and undergraduate students, which you can hopefully see here, the Visual Recognition Lab at UTSC. And fortunately enough, two of the students that I had the pleasure of working with over the last few years will also serve as teaching assistants in this course. And they're just 2 out of 4 teaching assistants who will be helping us making progress through this course at least until the reading week. So let me introduce to you Eric and Vignesh. They're both students of cognitive neuroscience with specific interests in visual cognition as related to perception and memory, just like myself. So they're very knowledgeable and they're very talented, and I would invite you to make use of their expertise and their advice as much as you should make use of my own. I should also make a brief mention at this point about the contact policy. So whenever you try to get in touch with them via email or with myself for that matter, I would strongly advise you to follow the email policy which is detailed in the syllabus. In particular, I will ask you to place PSYB55 in the subject line of any emails you address to us, and also to use your U of T email account whenever you try to contact us. That way we make sure that your emails land in the proper folders and we can respond to your inquiries in a timely manner. Of course, there's a lot more information in the syllabus, so I will advise you to take a very good look at the policies and all the other information about the course described in the syllabus. But for the time being, let's change gears and try to take a better look at some of the questions that we will be asking in this course. If you're going to spend as much time as we expect you to trying to figure out what cognitive neuroscience is about, then a couple of good questions to begin with are the following. How do I analyze or interpret information in my physical environment? And that relates to the study of perception, whether visual, auditory, tactile. Perception is also something that both myself and the TAs in this course are very much experts in. And that is for many reasons. One of them being that a lot of researchers believe that perception and motor control, the ability to move and to control movement, are the fundamental building blocks of cognition in biological systems. And to a large extent, other faculties are built on those faculties. So naturally, then an equally important question is, how do I manage to control my body, right? That is the issue of motor control. We have a tremendous ability to control fine movements. We are aware of that movement, whether of our fingers, our hands, our legs. So how do we manage to do that, and how do we learn to control our bodies? This is a tremendous task, and engineers in cognitive robotics still have difficulty trying to figure out how they can imitate those abilities in robot design. Just as interesting is the issue of attention. How do I dedicate mental energy so I can focus, let's say, on an external stimulus? In this case, hopefully, the present lecture. But also internal aspects of your own cognition or emotion. You may choose to pay attention to your own internal state, whether your present thoughts or your present plans or your goals for the day. And it is our intuition that to be able to achieve success in many tasks, we need to focus. Somehow we need to filter out what we might consider to be distractions, so we can devote more energy to specific things. So attention is key to the study of cognition, and also more broadly to the study of consciousness. Another important question revolves around memory, and to many, memory is what makes us, right? It is key to our own personality. We are who we are largely because of our past experiences and our ability to remember those experiences and capitalize on them. Our ability to draw upon old knowledge. So this involves a whole array of fantastic questions. How are we able to retrieve memories? How do we form memories in the first place? Is there a function for forgetting? Should we prevent forgetting? And if so, how do we do that? So again, memory is a huge field of research, and UFT has a tremendous group of researchers who dedicate much of their careers, if not their entire careers, to the study of memory. Okay, another important question relates to emotion, and you may not necessarily think about it as related to cognition, but emotion is an important part, a fundamental part of cognitive functioning. And presumably you have the experience of emotion helping you in a cognitive task or preventing you, distracting you from being successful in achieving a goal. Let's say reasoning successfully through the solution of a problem. So then the question is, how do we control emotion effectively? How should we do it? And then should we do it in the first place? And there are many other questions surrounding the study of emotion, such as what is the full spectrum of emotion? How should we categorize it? How should we describe it? this is a fascinating field of study in the study of cognition. Its own discipline is provided by what is called psycholinguistics, the study of language from the perspective of psychology. And again, this comprises a variety of questions, such as how are we able to comprehend spoken words or written speech? How are we able to read? Also, how are we able to write? How are we able to generate speech? Again, this is fascinating, and for many people, language is quintessential to human cognition. This, in many ways, is what sets us apart from animal models of cognition. Last but not least, how do we engage in goal-directed behavior? We largely move through our day trying to accomplish a series of tasks. We have a series of goals, and we structure our programs, our schedules, so that we can effectively make progress towards a goal. How can we do that? How are we able to articulate a goal? How are we able to make progress toward the goal? And how do we measure effectively that progress towards a specific goal? This is the study of cognitive control, and again, there is a great deal of interest in its study. However, what you might notice at this point is the fact that I haven't spoken at all about cognitive neuroscience per se, but rather, if you look at the big title on this slide, what I'm mentioning is big questions in cognitive science. And cognitive science is an umbrella term for the interdisciplinary study of cognition, which encompasses, but it is not limited to cognitive neuroscience. Rather, cognitive science circumscribes cognitive neuroscience, cognitive psychology, oftentimes cognitive robotics, and so on and so forth, right? So then what sets apart cognitive neuroscience from these other disciplines? And in many ways, it is the focus on neural processing. So it is the goal of this course not only to ask the questions that I have listed and summarized here, but rather to approach them from the perspective of neural processing. So we're not just going to ask, how do I control my body? Or how do I visually perceive the physical environment? But rather, how does my brain allow you to do that? What is the neural mechanism responsible for that? And this brings me to an important distinction, which is fundamental both at a theoretical level and at the level of administration, right? There is a course in cognitive psychology offered by our department, in as much as we have a introduction to cognitive neuroscience, which you are presently attending. And the distinction here briefly is that between the scientific study of mental processes, largely reflected in behavior and behavioral results, and then cognitive neuroscience, which is focused on the biology of the mind. Simply put, that is trying to relate the workings of the mind to specific functions of the brain. And for a long time, these different disciplines progressed independently of each other. It is possible to study the biology of the mind with focus on cognition while disregarding many psychological theories, in as much as it is possible to focus on the description of mental processes without caring so much about what brain structure implements a specific mental faculty and what happens if that part of the brain, let's say, it's damaged or not functioning properly. However, more recently, there is a greater convergence of research and much more synergy between cognitive psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists. And that is because it is through this synergy and joint interdisciplinary study of cognition that we can get the full picture of how we are able to engage in all these amazing tasks as related to perception, attention, memory, motor control. And then it is also because of several amazing biomedical technologies that we are able to embrace the study of cognition. So over the course of these lectures, we will become more familiar, for instance, with the application of functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, as well as electroencephalography, or EEG, in identifying the neural signature of a variety of mental processes. So neuroimaging, which encompasses these techniques, is fundamental nowadays to the study of cognition. Just as much as past animal studies or the study of cognitive deficits in patient populations. Those are also important milestones in the development of cognitive neuroscience theories. So again, it's through the marriage of cognitive psychology theories and cognitive neuroscience methodology and theory that we are finally able to understand much better how we as humans or animals, primates for that matter, can engage in perception and memory and attention. And this is not an easy task. If you are a cognitive neuroscientist, it's not enough to study behavior, right? Or an abstract description of a mental process. You need to pay attention to the biological hardware that makes possible those processes. And to a large extent, that refers to our brains. And there are many, many different ways to quantify brain complexity. But perhaps one of the simplest one is to simply count, to try to approximate the number of neurons in the adult human brain. And they might not be quite as many as the stars in the Milky Way, but not by much. There may be 200 to 400 billion stars in the Milky Way, but we have approximately 86 billion neurons in the adult human brain. And if you think about neurons as the building blocks of neural computations, you can finally start to understand the complexity of processes emerging from such a humongous computational machine. So the task is daunting, trying to understand the hardware that makes possible cognition in biological systems. But the results presently are also fascinating, and because of those results and the applications, there is a great deal of excitement about cognitive neuroscience. So it is important to balance the excitement and the caution, because cognitive neuroscience is a young science, or at least it is relatively young if compared, let's say, to physics or chemistry. Its origin dates back to the 60s and the 70s, so it's only a couple of decades old. And like it is the case with any young science, there is a lot of excitement about it. You can read about neuroscience in popular press, in the media, and this excitement is further encouraged by a wealth of empirical results and a constant influx of new ones that flood the market of news and the market of scientific results. And it is becoming increasingly difficult for theories to keep up with the wealth of empirical evidence, which also unfortunately leaves the door open to bias and misconception and error in a variety of ways. So like we might expect for a young science, it is especially important whenever you're dealing with cognitive neuroscience theories to exercise logical rigor and justified skepticism. Whenever you listen about its results in the media, as when you hear about it in class or even from an expert. And those qualities, logical rigor and justified skepticism, are just as important in a student in an intro class for cognitive neuroscience as they are in a seasoned cognitive neuroscientist. Having said that, I shouldn't try to belittle in any way the excitement about cognitive neuroscience. And that's not just because in itself, cognitive neuroscience as a scientific field is fascinating, but also because of the real world applications that this discipline has made and aims to make possible in the not so distant future. So, for instance, many of you might be familiar with the term biomarkers, which refers to biological markers, neural indicators in many cases of specific diseases or disorders. To take one example, dementia is one of those neurodegenerative disorders that is large part of the scientific community dedicated to in its study. And the goal there, or at least one of the important goals, is to identify the neural signatures associated with the presence of the disease. And again, there are many methods through which we can do that, some of which rely on neuroimaging, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging and also structural magnetic resonance imaging. But equally important is not just the diagnosis, but also identifying risk factors in the development of the disease. And you can truly appreciate the importance of this type of research, because if you can identify in advance the likelihood of developing this disorder in a currently healthy adult, then you can target this individual specific therapies that can delay or ultimately prevent the development of dementia. So this makes this enterprise so worthwhile, and this is something that many scientists are currently working towards, both in the clinical field and in the basic research field. What about the rehabilitation of the injured brain, whether due to a traumatic accident or due to disease? How can we do that, and how can we map its progress? We already know that the brain has a tremendous capacity for self-repair. It is well known for neuroplasticity, right? The ability to change in response to certain factors. But we also know that some people recover much faster from some injuries than others. And we also know that some procedures, let's say some types of neural surgery, might be more effective for some than for others. So then it is fundamental to understand what allows some individuals to recover faster through neuroplasticity relative to others, and how different medical procedures should target the treatment of these disorders in a much more informed fashion. On a related note, probably some of you have heard the term of brain-computer interfaces. And currently there is a lot of excitement and hype about the development of BCIs. To take an example that speaks to it, let's take the case of a stroke patient who is presently unable to effectively move his or her limbs. Then one solution explored by interdisciplinary teams of cognitive neuroscientists and biomedical engineers, as well as medical personnel, is to develop robotic limbs, let's say prosthetic arms, that can be controlled through a neural input. So let's say we have the understanding of how the brain controls movement. Then we can divert the inputs that we record from specific parts of the human brain to the control of a robotic arm, and that can allow us, let's say, to turn on our computers, read our emails, or even control a wheelchair when otherwise we would be deprived or severely impaired in our ability to move. So again, this is a fascinating field of research, and we already see tremendous progress through the use of both invasive techniques that require surgery and non-invasive ones, such as the use of scalp sensors placed on the top of somebody's head for the purpose of recording neural data. Last but not least, you might be familiar with the impact that the study of various psychoactive drugs has on human behavior, and that impact also translates into public policy. To take a relevant example, is the use of marijuana bad for your brain? It's a question that we don't quite have a complete answer to yet. But probably the use of marijuana is quite different from individual to individual. So what is this individual variability informed by in terms of neural signatures? And in what cases is it bad? How can we monitor the impact on cognitive functioning? And what mental faculties are particularly impacted by it, and to what degree? So I hope you can all agree that these are not only fundamental questions from a science perspective, but they have very clear-cut implications from a practical standpoint. Now though, before we move any further with the course material, I want to take a couple of minutes to review briefly the syllabus. And I'm going to start by reviewing the course learning outcomes and try to motivate their value. So after the successful completion of this course, we hope that you will have demonstrated the ability to first describe the complementary roles of cognitive neuroscience and psychology. And this is a topic that we already started to discuss. And the emphasis here is in trying to understand and value how a holistic understanding of the workings of the mind can be achieved through the combination of different techniques and approaches from multiple fields. Another learning outcome is driven by a fundamental fact in science, not just in cognitive neuroscience or neuroscience more generally, and that is that a lot of the progress is due not just by the creativity of the theoreticians and experimentalists in a field, but also by the power and sophistication of the methods, tools, and instruments that make possible asking more difficult questions and getting much more fine-grained answers. So to a large extent, progress in science is driven by methodology and by technology. So we need to understand what kind of methods, techniques, and instruments make possible the current progress and success of research in cognitive neuroscience. But that does not, by all means, come at the cost of theories in cognitive neuroscience. So it is the goal of this course to introduce you to some of the core theories in different domains of cognitive neuroscience. And of course, we're not going to be able to cover the broad spectrum of these theories because cognitive neuroscience is a huge field. But at the very least, we should be able to take a close look at some of the most influential, the most seminal theories in the study of memory, attention, vision, and so on and so forth. And it's not just with the goal of trying to get the flavor of these theories, but also, and this brings me back to the more general aim of adopting a critical standpoint when evaluating findings in cognitive neuroscience. So it is driven by the need to evaluate evidence in these fields and subdisciplines very carefully. Because it is the evidence that props up these theories and garners their success and their credibility. So we'll try to be critical about this evidence, and we'll try to see both the pros, the cons, the strengths, and weaknesses of various pieces of evidence. Now, beyond content that is specific to a field, the course also has some domain general objectives. One of them being to take that critical thinking mindset and apply it not only to evaluating and digesting the content of this course as related to cognitive neuroscience, but also to apply it to producing thoughtful, cogent responses as prompted by questions presented to you on a weekly basis, and definitely associated with the exams. Another practical learning outcome concerns the ability to describe the major elements of an empirical article, and this is the type of skill that you develop and you sharpen over many years of study. And if you continue down the path of research during achieving excellence in scholarship. So it is an ever-growing skill. It's something that you never stop becoming better at. And this is perhaps your first chance to start developing that skill. So we can take an empirical article and identify its major elements, and try to consume the main parts of that article. Understand where the structure it's coming from, what the conclusions are, and what's the evidence support for a given article. In this case, articles in cognitive neuroscience. So most likely you will have the opportunity to further develop this skill in C and D level courses. However, later during your academic training, those skills might be taken for granted. So this is perhaps a good opportunity to start developing that specific set of skills. Last but not least, you should try to better understand and articulate the integrative nature of cognition. And it should come as no surprise, if you think about it, that cognition is not a series of isolated blocks. It is definitely convenient to study them as such. It is pragmatic, but in many ways it can also be misleading. Whenever you engage in a meaningful task, let's say attending this course or paying attention to this lecture, it's not just attention that comes into play. It's vision, the ability to read what's currently on your computer screen. It's auditory perception, listening to the instructor's voice. It is memory, bringing into play information that you already had access to, concepts that you're already familiar with. Cognitive control, the ability to see how this course material relates to your current goals within and beyond the framework of this course, and so on and so forth. So most of the time, any meaningful task involves a series of different cognitive abilities, and that speaks to the very nature of cognition. So trying to understand the integrative and hierarchical nature of cognitive processes is fundamental to being able to appreciate how cognition is structured and how the brain facilitates cognition. Okay, so if these are the goals, then what are the materials that support your progress through this course? And first of all, I would point towards the lectures. You are expected to watch all lectures and to go over the PDFs associated with these lectures. And they're meant not only to bring more clarity to the amount of and the nature of the information in the textbook, but also to complement it. Having said that, for the purpose of textbook, we will be using the leading cognitive neuroscience textbook in the world. And it so happens that the first author, Mike Zaniga, is also one of the co-founders of cognitive neuroscience from the early 70s. So go over the content of this book. Is quite useful, and you are in good hands whenever trying to appreciate the complexity of the field and its content. Now, we will be using the 2018 version of the book, and that means that older or newer versions, editions of the textbook are not okay because significant differences exist across them. Some might wonder why are we not using a more recent version, and there are at least two reasons for that. The 2020 version of the book that is the newest also happens to be more of a reference book, a collection of articles rather than a textbook. So for this reason, I currently prefer the 2018 textbook. From a practical perspective, that also means that this older version of the textbook is more widely available on the web and more affordable if you attempt to purchase it. So both from a theory-driven and from a practical standpoint, the 2018 version of the book is the one that we will be using this term. Any other information about the course, announcements, PDFs of lecture slides, exam marks will be made available, as you might expect, through Quarkus. Okay, so these are the goals. These are the materials for the course. What about evaluation? Well, there are 2 midterm examinations during the course and 1 final examination. And they are structured so that each of the midterms cover 4 lectures, while the final examination is cumulative. However, we make every effort that the emphasis is placed for the final examination, especially on the course material at the end of the course. That means the material that is not necessarily covered by the 2 midterms. And we will also add 1 journal article later during the course. Another thing that you might notice here is the fact that there is an increasing grade scale. So we move from 27% to 33% to 40% of the course grade throughout the exams. And the goal of this structure is so that you have the opportunity to develop the skills and the ability to digest the content of the course and do progress in your ability to be successful in an examination. So what do these examinations contain content-wise? Well, they are entirely made up of multiple choice and short answers. And there is significant emphasis on the material in the lecture. So it's about a 75 to 25% weighting scheme that favors lecture versus textbook material. And one thing that I should notice here is the fact that rote memorization will simply not be enough to be successful in this course, because in addition to demonstrating foundational knowledge of core ideas and theories, we aim to encompass in the evaluation for this course your knowledge of theories and methods as applied to novel situations. So you do have to exercise critical thinking in how what you know applies and generalizes to novel circumstances, to novel situations. And to help you with that, we will strive to make practice questions available for every lecture. In some cases, especially at the beginning, they will be accompanied by answers. Later during the course, some of the questions will not necessarily be made available with associated answers, and that way we encourage you to think through the questions very carefully, and if in doubt, you can reach out to us and let us know what you believe the answers might be. A few other housekeeping pieces. Naturally, we expect you to understand and follow the policies described in detail in the syllabus. So before you move on with the rest of the lectures and the course material, I would recommend that you take a very close look at the syllabus, and even later during the term, if you are in doubt as to any policy regarding the course, please check the syllabus first before you reach out to the TAs or to myself. All lecture materials will be posted typically by the first day of each week of classes. So if this happens to be Monday, probably most of these materials will be made available Monday morning at the latest. Cognitive neuroscience is a big field, and there is plenty of material to cover. So if you have any questions or concerns about the course, if you feel overwhelmed or confused about the course material, I will recommend that you connect with the TAs right away or with myself. Now, as you know, there are no in-person office hours due to the COVID-19 situation. However, we will host virtual Zoom office hours. So while we will be missing the ability to naturally communicate in person, there is a benefit of virtual office hours, and that is flexibility. So use that to your advantage. We will be making available 3 different time slots throughout the week, so you have ample opportunity to connect with TAs and with myself depending on your schedule. It does go without saying that we hope and we expect you to behave with integrity during the assessments. There are specific challenges associated with online testing. However, it is the goal of an assessment that it should be your own assessment. So performance during the exam is not a collaborative exercise. We hope that you keep that in mind when preparing for the assessments and when going through the exams. Last, before we return to the proper course material, I do want to mention a few tips for being successful in this course, and this can apply perhaps to many other courses that you're currently taking or you will be taking, but it is especially useful to mention them given the current situation related to COVID-19. And the first thing that I want to touch upon is making a schedule and being disciplined about how you engage with this course. So we strongly advise that you make a plan, you create a schedule so that you can watch lectures, read the textbook, and engage the practice questions on a routine, hopefully weekly basis. For instance, it's not a good idea to try to address a lot of material right before an exam. It can be stressful and it might not necessarily be the most successful strategy. So create a thoughtful plan and have the discipline to stick to it. Secondly, there is a temptation when time and energy is lacking to just go for the gist of something, to get the flavor of a particular theory or more generally the content of the course. But you can certainly do better. If you truly want to be successful in this course, aim to be good enough, in the sense that you should step beyond rote memorization and you should try to explain ideas and processes in your own words. And this is the first step to gaining the mastery of content and skills as related to this course. Third, and I believe I have already mentioned this, have the foresight to get feedback on your progress. So whenever in doubt as to how successful you are in comprehending the content of this course, feel free to get in touch with the TAs and myself. And last, and I realize this sounds quite general, but it is important, try to adopt a growth mindset. Instead of just going through the course, try to assess your own progress. It is our job to challenge you, to intrigue you, but also to help empower you to be more capable in understanding a very exciting but also quite difficult field of study. So be mindful of the fact that if you want to see growth from an intellectual standpoint, substantive learning and growth will take work, time, and dedication. So by all means, try to take the work, the time, and the dedication and put them into this course if you want to see such a growth. Okay, so with that being said, let's move on to today's lecture objectives. And I'm quickly going to list them and provide a brief description for each of them. First, and I hope this one is quite obvious, we aim to describe the value and the intrinsic challenges of the cognitive approach to studying the mind. Then, we aim to describe how and why localization of function is such an important way of thinking in neuroscience. And localization of function has been key to how neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience in particular has developed across decades. But it also has its own limitations, and it is important to see those limitations and appreciate them. Another objective is to be able to articulate multiple clear examples where localization of function accurately appears to describe brain function, and we're going to go over quite a number of them in today's lecture. Complementary to localization of function is the idea that the brain works and fundamentally relies not just on separate, independent cortical regions, but rather on entire cortical networks. And that an intrinsic hierarchy of the brain is responsible for the structure of these cortical networks, which brings a lot more sophistication and complexity, but also difficulty of research and of study to the localization of function. And finally, we aim to be able to articulate why it is fair to characterize cognitive neuroscience as an interdisciplinary field. And we already mentioned the umbrella term of cognitive science that puts together or brings together many different fields in the study of cognition. But make no mistake, cognitive neuroscience in itself is also interdisciplinary. So we should be able to understand where the need for such interdisciplinarity arises from and what it can do for us. Okay, now there are lots of challenges that cognitive neuroscience is trying to solve. But if we were to compress all of those challenges, and if we were to simplify them, then perhaps the biggest challenge of all can be described as such. There is a stimulus, there is an input that our brains process, and in response to that stimulus, in response to that input, there is an output, typically a type of behavior, let's say a motor response. What happens in between? How does the brain mediate the relationship between the input and the output? And to make that a bit clearer, let's think of a simple example. You wake up in the morning, perhaps late, as you hear the alarm clock going on, and you realize you're late for an interview, right? So then you rush to make it through the morning, to make it through traffic, and you finally show up for that interview, whether in person in this case, or perhaps nowadays they'll be more relevant online. So there's quite a complex number of steps and sequence of steps involved in that process. You have to carefully monitor and control your behavior from the moment you have that realization that you're late to the moment when you arrive to that interview, and perhaps more likely you apologize for being late. So what's going on? What happens between the initial input and the final output and all the other outputs that are intermediary? And this is not an easy problem to solve. If you just think about it, there are many different aspects of cognition that come into play. So how do they all bring to bear on the final output, and how do they work in concert to generate a complex behavior? And to start to understand how this happens, many different schools of thought have been born out of psychology initially, and later from neuroscience. But if we turn to history, perhaps the first one to pay attention to, and what many consider to be the first school of psychology, is called structuralism. And very briefly, since perhaps you already know about it from AO1, what structuralism attempted to do in the old days is think of cognition or cognitive phenomena such as memory, perception, motivation as complex events that need to be dissected, that need to be analyzed into their intrinsic structure. So again, the idea of structuralism as a field of study and research in early psychology was to conceive of cognitive phenomena as complex events or states and try to analyze them into their components. And the main method of structuralism was introspection, which is essentially self-analysis, relying on self-awareness. You don't necessarily need to be a psychologist to rely on introspection. We tend to do that in our daily lives as well. However, introspection as a method of research was a lot more systematic and guided by specific rules and recommendations. So initially, what the parents of structuralism thought of introspection was that it is necessary and perhaps unique to understanding mental processes. So whenever you're inspected, let's say with an object, you would be invited to describe all the cognitive events that happen around your perception of that object. The color, the shape, the sensation, the emotions associated with it, the memories that it triggers, and so on and so forth. And this method was applied to many different things, including emotion. So to take a different example, let's say you experience anger, then what introspection would have you do is try to analyze very carefully both the physiological state and the mental state associated with genuine anger. So what happens with your body, right? If you pay attention, are you starting to sweat? Perhaps your body starts shaking. Perhaps your body becomes more tense. These are all bodily reactions, physiological reactions. And in addition to that, you should also be paying attention to what happens in your mind. Perhaps there is this intense negative feeling, emotion directed towards an object or a situation, or perhaps even somebody, right? Perhaps you have difficulty starting to focus on any other things, and you become a lot less efficient in other tasks, right? So both analysis of physiological and internal mental states is the target of introspection. And this is valuable. This was a great start to trying to make sense of the mind, but as you realize, it also has its own very deep intrinsic limitations. One of which is quite obvious. There is little objectivity to it. You're using your own mind to study your mind, and no one else has immediate direct access to that tool in this particular as part of this particular school of thought, right? So there is too much self-reliance in that sense. You're analyzing a private event. There's no additional objective corroboration of the findings or interpretation of what you experience. Secondly, there are plenty of things that happen outside awareness because they're much too fine-grained within the architecture of a much more complex phenomenon that self-awareness can get access to, or perhaps because they happen at a time scale that does not allow introspection. And memory can often happen to fall in that case, right? One moment you might not remember the name of the person, and the next moment the name of this acquaintance just happens to pop into your head. What happened there? This is quite a complex mental phenomenon, yet it happens so quickly that introspection does not have the ability to account for it, to identify and dissect its structure. So again, introspection was a great method. It definitely helped put psychology on the right track, but it also had significant limitations. And perhaps, but not entirely due to these limitations, psychology took a big turn at the beginning of the 20th century. And what I mean by big turn here refers to behaviorism, a major and hugely influential school of thought in psychology. And the core idea of behaviorism is that psychology is essentially the science of behavior, not of the mind, which is unobservable and hence should not be a target of scientific inquiry, but of behavior and all its aspects. So this is a complete shift from structuralism. We moved on from the mind to behavior. And this led to tremendous progress, some of which is certainly relevant for what's going nowadays in psychology. For instance, a lot of value was placed on associative learning and different forms of conditioning, which is certainly very popular and informative nowadays when studying animal cognition, or even in clinical psychology, for instance, when we try to explain the genesis and the structure of trauma and phobias, right? So this is certainly important, and perhaps closer to home, it led to detailed analysis of behavioral performance, and this is something that we definitely use today. Most behavioral experiments pay very close attention to accuracy and reaction time. How good are you at performing a given task? How precise, how correct, and how efficient are you? How quick are you, depending on a variety of circumstances or different experimental conditions. And behaviorism was certainly valuable in explaining, detailing the value of these measures of behavior and the value in trying to understand and dissect cognition. Yet at the same time, behaviorism is often referred to as the dark ages of psychology. And that is because it turned away from the mind. It disparaged the mind as a field of study because presumably is unobservable. But this came at its own cost, because while behavior can take you very far while you're trying to explain some relatively simple phenomena, if you're trying to account for complex mental processes and faculties such as language development, behaviorism fails to do such a great job. And this is what, to a large extent, triggered what is called the cognitive revolution in the 1960s. Behaviorism made an attempt to explain language, which was frankly laughed at by linguists and psycholinguists. Something as just trying to link the input and the output without paying close attention to the workings of the mind seems to be the wrong approach when trying to explain how we develop linguistic abilities, how we learn language, how we learn to comprehend and produce language. And just because the mind is difficult to observe, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should give up on it. Rather, we should embrace that challenge and develop and sharpen the tools that allow us to study the mind. So this is what the cognitive revolution did. And not coincidentally, it also happened at the time in which computers became much more popular in the public eye. And because of that, computers started to become also metaphors, if not models, for the mind. Therefore, providing an alternative for the workings of the human mind. And more generally, it emphasized the idea that the mind relies on a series of computations, right? Whatever happens does not necessarily have just a structure, but it relies on processes that relate to each other. You can think of the mind as an organ that processes information. So then the question becomes, how do we process that information that aims to relate the input to the output? And James McClellan and David Rumelhart had a fantastic contribution to cognitivism in that regard by innovating and by proposing what is known to this day as the parallel distributed processing framework. So let's try to go over that. And the distinction that they paid a lot of attention to is that between serial and parallel processing. What happens when I'm trying to relate the input with a response to mediate that relationship? Perhaps what I do is a sequence of steps. And let me be more concrete here. Let's say that I'm talking about my reaction to being offered a cup of coffee by a friend. So this is the input. Somebody is offering me a cup of coffee, and I may choose to accept that cup of coffee or not. What goes on there? What happens in my mind? Well, lots of things can happen. First of all, I got to think about whether I want and I need that cup of coffee at that time of day. Do I even like coffee in the first place? And then, is it socially acceptable or advisable to say yes to that cup of coffee, or perhaps should I politely decline? Well, there are lots of different things that can and should happen for me to reach a decision. And if all of them happen serially as a sequence of steps, that would be a very belabored, inefficient, and slow process. So perhaps what happens instead is a parallel process. Many different things can happen at the same time, right? I can think whether I like coffee, I want coffee, and it is socially acceptable for me to say yes all at the same time. Perhaps those things interact with each other, and ultimately they allow me to reach a decision much faster and much more efficiently. This is parallel, interactive, distributed processing. And here I'm talking about it in the context of decision making, but it was huge in its ability to explain language development. So, for instance, it was successfully applied in the study of reading comprehension, in being able to understand and make sense of orthographic information. And this satisfied linguists. What behaviorism could not do, suddenly cognitivism, through the use of parallel distributed processing, could make huge strides to understanding the complexity of language and language development. And just as a side note, you might notice that we have quite a few pictures on the side here with names and dates, but to be clear, none of that is meant to serve as something you should remember for the purpose of the exam. All of this information is just so that we place the big ideas of this course in proper historical context. So now there is a lot about history that can be mentioned here, and we don't have enough time to go into all the details in different schools of thought and their versions and alternatives and competing schools. However, what would be useful to quickly do is go over the key lessons we have learned about cognition over the last few decades, especially under the influence of cognitivism. And one of the things we certainly learn about is the fact that cognitive resources appear to be limited. You pay attention to something, you do it at the expense of something else. However, it's not clear to what extent that limit is strictly enforced. Can we push out those limits? Can those limits get worse for us? These are important questions. Also, and this might seem trivial for you, but at some point it wasn't obvious, cognition is important for functioning well in the world. If you do want to function well, if you care about your well-being, then memory is essential, perception is important, your ability to regulate your emotions, to reach decisions efficiently is also important. So cognition is key ultimately to well-being and to well-functioning. Furthermore, there is variability. There is plenty of variability in cognitive functioning. There is variability at the level of the single subject. So let's say I'm trying to engage in a reasoning task early morning, and because I'm wide awake and I have plenty of energy, I'm quite good at that reasoning task. But later during the day, because I get more fatigued, I may not do so well. Yet accepting that cup of coffee from a friend can go a long way, and perhaps half an hour later I'm again on the top of my game when it comes to reasoning. These are all within subject differences. differences that may be explained by time of day or circumstance or motivation and so on and so forth. Equally important and pervasive are between subject differences in cognitive functioning. Perhaps you are better than me at reasoning in the early morning, but perhaps I may be better than you at face recognition. And similarly, we have very different cognitive profiles from each other. Some of us are better at some cognitive tasks than others, and some might be worse. So again, there is a huge variety, heterogeneity in our cognitive profiles in terms of what we can do well and what we can do less well. And the field of between subject or interindividual and general within and between subject differences is huge in cognitive psychology nowadays. Variability is accompanied by flexibility. And again, it should come as no surprise that cognitive abilities change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. This happens as we develop, as we mature, and also as we age. It can also happen with the arrival as dysfunction or of an accident. You have a concussion, perhaps your memory and your decision-making abilities become slightly worse for a while, but over time, and possibly with therapy and treatment, you can regain those cognitive abilities. And this is related to the idea of malleability. Most cognitive abilities can be trained, then can be made better. Something as fundamental as perception, for instance, can be trained. Most of us, for instance, are experts at face recognition, and that's because we have lots of experience with recognizing faces. But some of us are also experts at recognizing cars, and that is because we care about cars, so we can very quickly discriminate between different models. Some are also experts at recognizing birds, birders, right? So perception can be trained. In as much as reasoning can be trained, memory can be trained, attention can be trained. So cognitive abilities are malleable and we can improve on them. So these are all big lessons that we learned about cognition over the last few decades. And cognitivism had a huge influence in learning these things and how we approach the study of the mind. To the extent to which it also led to a change of guard in psychology departments. Suddenly, entire groups of people who studied or focused on behavior were replaced in the 60s and the 70s by people that studied the mind. And we all benefit from that change of guard now. And I should mention as a side note that that change of guard happens every couple of decades or so. So a much closer and relevant example, for instance, for my training was that in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, an entire generation of psychologists that refused to accept the merits of neuroimaging techniques and discounting them as simply producing pretty pictures of the brain was replaced by a new generation of psychologists and neuroscientists that place neuroimaging such as fMRI and EEG at the center of their careers and research practice as fundamental tools in trying to understand how the mind and the brain works. So this change of guard and this change of thinking about cognition was hugely beneficial and hugely influential. And we have learned some important things from it. However, one of the things that we haven't addressed so far is what gives rise to cognition. How can we account for the genesis of cognitive processes? And to try to answer that question, I'm going to take a step even further back in time. Nowadays, we all take for granted the idea that the mind is related to the workings of the brain. But how old is this idea? And it is quite old. The first inklings into the fact that the mind is related to the brain can be traced back to the earliest record of medical treatment for a traumatic injury in ancient Egypt. This is a 4,500 to 5,000 year old document, and it contains references to 48 cases. By this, I mean the Edwin Smith papyrus, which you will encounter or hear about if you're interested in pre-health studies and medicine in particular. It's a milestone in the history of medical treatment. And it is specifically relevant to us because some of the cases described in this earliest treatise on traumatic injury are brain related. Specifically, what the papyrus mentions is the description and the treatment of brain swelling that follows traumatic brain injury, TBI for short. And many of you are familiar with the fact that as a result of brain injury, brain concussion, let's say, swelling can occur. And this should come as no surprise. This is a normal bodily physiological reaction which we encounter generally through the human organism. It can happen to your arm, it swells if it gets hit. It can happen to your leg. It can happen just as much to your brain. It's part of a response, of a natural response that promotes healing. However, this happens to be a problem for the brain, and that is because the brain is encased within this rigid structure, the human skull, which places considerable amounts of pressure on the brain that in case it is swelling. And that pressure can result in significant brain damage and ultimately death in a considerable percentage of cases. So the Egyptians did note that, and did note that by opening up the skull, they can relieve some of that pressure and increase someone's chances of survival. Why is this ultimately interesting? Well, because it hinted at the localization of function. They noted that if the injury happens to some part of the brain rather than the other, the cognitive impairment that results out of this differential patterns of injuries are also different. And the Egyptians went to quite a great length to explain how you should examine and how you should treat brain swelling in such cases. However, at no point is there an explicit relationship made between cognition or the mind more generally and the brain. They did not necessarily believe that the brain is the seat of the mind. And that is because rather than thinking of the brain as crucial, they thought that it is the heart that is responsible for the mind. And this is largely referred to as the cardiac hypothesis. For instance, for mummification purposes, the brain was often removed because they thought the heart was the seat of intelligence. Hence, removing the brain was not essential for somebody's passing into the afterlife. Okay, so why would anyone believe that the heart is truly the seat of the mind rather than the brain? And while that may sound funny nowadays, vestiges of this cardiac hypothesis can be found everywhere in popular culture. You can tell about somebody stealing your heart, or you can talk about your heart being not in the right place. So what does it mean? Well, it traces back to the idea that emotions motivations, decisions are the result of heart function, right? It is the heart that guides your behavior, that guides your feelings, and ultimately reasoning and your mind as a whole. What about the scientific evidence? Even here, this hypothesis is not as ludicrous as it might sound at the beginning. Heart problems can result in cognition problems. If you suffer from a cardiac arrest, you might have unreliable memory for a while. But it was the ancient Greeks that paid more attention to the systematic relationship between brain injury and cognitive deficits. It was Alcmaeon of Croton who noticed this, and it was also Galen who specifically noted that if the damage occurs in an individual to the back of the head, that might result in vision problems, but the same does not happen if it is the front rather than the back of the head which suffers from injury. And this to us is no surprise nowadays, because we know that the visual cortex is at the back of the head. So damaging it most certainly will result in vision problems. Okay, so now while the Greeks made a significant contribution to promoting the idea that the mind is hosted by the brain, it was much later, during the 17th century, that Descartes finally brought this idea into the scientific field and into philosophy, and promoted it, put it on the right track in some ways, not all. Descartes happened to be a huge proponent and one of the central figures of rationalism. He thought that it is through reason rather than through sensory evidence that we can gain knowledge and information, we can build concepts, and we can examine ourselves and our minds, right? And by using the rationalism as a framework, he pondered over the functioning of the mind and its grounding in the physical world. And what he argued was that there is a critical relationship between the mind and the brain. However, they are different things. And this refers to the dualism hypothesis. The mind and the brain are related, but they are different. They are not one, as suggested by monism. However, there is presumably a central part of the brain that allows that relationship to be made. He thought that the mind is related through the brain, through the pineal gland. So why did he single out this specific part of the brain as the central interface between the mind and the brain? Well, he reasoned that most brain structures are bilateral, and by that I mean that you can find them both on the left and the right side of the brain, while the pineal gland is unique, and its central placement also argues for a unique function. So what might that unique function be? Presumably it is its ability to interface mind and brain, and he provided some very colorful and intuitive examples of how that might happen. For instance, he tried to explain reflexes, very interestingly depicted here as an individual who places his naked foot close to a fire, and then as a result of the sensation that travels through fluids hosted in a nerve tube to the pineal gland, it allows somebody to make the decision to retract, to pull back that foot. So this is a very colorful way of illustrating, but hopefully very intuitive way of depicting what he thought the mind and the brain allow you to do. It is most certainly not correct. For instance, nerves are not tubes filled by fluids, and it is not even true the fact that you need a connection of a limb to the brain in order to have reflexes. We know that from patients with traumatic from spinal cord injury, who even in the absence of an intact connection between the brain and specific limb, in this case the leg, can exhibit reflexes. Another interesting result or illustration is vision. He thought that light touches particles in your eyes and they communicate somehow with the pineal gland, which allows you to make sense through your mind of what you see out there in the world. And some aspects of his description are not entirely wrong, but the fundamentals in some way are. So the idea of dualism, the pineal gland were one by one discredited with the passage of time. However, before we disparage Descartes anymore, we should rather point out his contribution. His contribution and his influence on the scientific field in articulating clearly the idea that the brain is the seat of the mind, and we should focus on the study of the brain if we try to understand the mind to some extent. An important milestone in the history of that idea traces back to a much more recent study and direction of the investigation, and by that I actually mean the 1800s. So this traces to a gentleman called Angelo Mosso, who took a lot of interest in the cardiovascular system, and he had the luck to encounter a most unfortunate patient, an individual who suffered from brain injury as a result of concussion. He had a brick falling from about 40 feet onto his head, as a result of which his skull was partly shattered and his brain was exposed. So Angelo made clever use of that to measure blood flow and blood pressure in the brain along with other parts of the body. And interestingly enough, what he noticed was that there are changes associated with blood pressure as a result of certain tasks or certain changes in circumstance with regard to the patient. So what do I mean by that? Well, he measured blood pressure as a result of the individual, the patient, resting quietly and comfortably. And then he noticed what happened as a result of, let's say, a perceptual event. The room clock strikes 12 at noon, and the church bells are suddenly heard. He noticed a sudden change in blood pressure following that event. He also noticed changes in brain blood pressure as a result of asking the patient a question. So that was very interesting, and it led to the hypothesis that blood flow is central to how the brain is involved in cognition, and described this in a widely popular book at the time and hugely influential, The Circulation of Blood in the Human Brain. And if you think about it today, from our perspective, this certainly makes sense. Blood carries oxygen and glucose to the brain. It allows neural processes to unfold efficiently. And cognition requires energy. It is the blood that carries oxygen and glucose and allows, it facilitates that source of metabolic energy there. And about 100 years later, this turned or was critical for the invention of functional magnetic resonance imaging, one of the dominant methods for neuroimaging nowadays, which relies on tracking down cognitive processes, the changes in blood flow activity in different parts of the brain. But again, this was around 100 years before the invention of fMRI. So at this stage, I think there is little doubt as to the fact that the brain is the seat of the mind, and it is critical for cognition. So if you finally agree to that idea, then you come to realize the importance of neuroscience in the psychological study of cognition. And then perhaps one of the fundamental questions that we have to ask right away is, how is the brain organized, and how is brain organization relevant for cognition? Well, the beginning of the 20th century saw one of the most lively and colorful disputes in that sense. And what scientists at the time tried to determine is the fundamental organization of the brain, its structure. And especially popular at the time was a theory put out and supported by Golgi, the so-called reticular theory, which he supported by using a special dye. He was responsible for what's called to this day the Golgi stain method, that enabled him to look at brain tissue. So what does this theory states? Well, Golgi's belief was that the brain is one unitary network of nervous fibers. Hence, we have to treat it as a single unitary network. On the other hand, interestingly enough, Ramon y Cajal, a Spanish scientist, further improved Golgi's dye method, Golgi's stain methodology, and tried to provide evidence for the fact that the brain is not one giant unitary mass of nervous fibers, but instead it is a collection of neurons, many neurons that communicate with each other. Interestingly enough, Golgi and Cajal shared a Nobel Prize in Medicine at the beginning of the 20th century, and upon receiving the prize, they berated each other for their own, or rather for each other's naivety. This was a very passionate and interesting dispute in the scientific world, and it was not until the 1950s, with the arrival of electron microscopy, that the final nail was placed in the coffin of Golgi's particular theory by proving without any doubt the presence and the importance of neurons, of neural cells, for the organization and for the structure of the brain. So there is a lot of complexity to the brain, and the billions and billions of neurons that make up human brain definitely prove that point. And now there are many ways in which we can quantify and describe the structure of the brain, but perhaps another aspect that deserves attention is the organization of gray matter. The gray matter is a sheet of neurons that lie at the outward surface of the brain. And while this might also seem like a unitary structure, it is not. Gray matter is the result of the formation of multiple progressive layers or laminae during neurodevelopment. So all these sheets that emerge, that are developed from the inside out over the course of neurodevelopment, serve different purposes, and with good reason. Some of them receive information, some of them send information to other parts of the brain, while some other laminae are responsible for integrating and processing information. So there is method to this madness, and all of this leads us into the next question, which is, how is this complex structure responsible for cognition? Well, interestingly enough, the discussion about brain function led to two competing theories and a big debate, which to some extent reflects at the level of function the debate about anatomy, previously featured in the work of Golgi and Cahal. So what do these competing theories claim? Well, on the one hand, we have the aggregate field theory promoted by people such as Pierre Florent, that states that the human brain acts as a whole. There is not necessarily any specialization to a particular part of the brain. And there was plenty of evidence for this theory. For instance, by damaging the mouse brain, one could see that progressive or increasing levels of lesion impact more and more the performance of the mouse. But there was no evidence that damaging one part versus another lead to differential types of behavior. On the other hand, the localization of function made much more powerful claims about different parts of the brain hosting different types of attributes and mental processes. And perhaps the most ambitious and unfortunately also wrong approach in illustrating this theory is phrenology, with which you might be familiar from Intro to Psych. Well, this phrenology pseudoscience was especially ambitious because it tried to produce a map of the brain, right? A full map of the brain, and how this map can be linked to different aspects of someone's personality and cognition. So this was great, and this was indeed very ambitious. However, the way in which this was done was quite questionable even at the time. What phrenology supporters stated was that by measuring bumps on somebody's skull, they can correlate over a sufficient number of cases with traits of character or cognition. So for instance, you can find areas responsible for benevolence or firmness or self-esteem, and so on and so forth. So this is truly a extreme case of belief, or rather of equating correlation with causation, which, as you all know, is wrong. And this gained a wide audience, both amongst scientists and amongst the overall public, right? Because it had concrete practical applications and implications. For instance, if a woman had a relatively low bump on the head associated with a maternity brain area, then probably should not be encouraged to become a mother, right? If somebody's benevolence area was relatively small, as shown by the absence of a bump or a relatively small one in comparison to other people, then perhaps that is not necessarily a person of good behavior, and so on and so forth. So localization of function as illustrated by phrenology is an extreme and misguided approach. However, it is ambitious, it gained a lot of popularity, and because of that, it encouraged scientists to think about function and brain anatomy in a much more structured, systematic, and overall more scientific way. So, what are some of the better ways to uncover brain organization and its relevance to cognitive function? Corbidi and Brotman, a German neurologist and biologist, provided a completely different approach to understanding brain organization, which did not focus on function. As opposed to other of his predecessors, what Brotman did instead was look not at gross anatomy, but at fine level anatomy or histology, the fine grain level cellular structure of gray matter tissue as seen under a microscope. And Brodmann's task was quite daunting. He tried to identify all the different types of cellular organization visible under a microscope for the entire cerebral cortex. And in doing so, he constructing a map of 52 different areas with unique histological properties. Now, the numbers here do not necessarily mean anything in themselves. So it is not necessarily the case that region 41 and 42 perform different functions, for instance, or that all the neurons in 42 perform the same function. All this means is that the brain has a histological organization that can be described based on this division into 52 different areas. And there might be immediately a temptation to try and believe that each region corresponds to a unique function in the same way in which phrenologists associated different bumps on the head with different functions. But Brodmann did not commit to this enterprise. This is purely a structural, anatomical description of gray matter. However, the question still remained. Is there such a thing as localization of function, whether related directly or indirectly to Brodmann's areas? And there are different pieces of evidence for the localization of function. So we're quickly gonna try to go through at least a couple of them, which are of particular historical significance and pieces of evidence that really shape the way in which we think about brain organization and its relation to cognitive function. For anyone who has come across the idea of functional localization in the human brain, but perhaps the first example that comes to mind is that of Broca's area. Paul Broca was a French anatomist and anthropologist in the 1800s who happened to come across a very interesting individual. Someone who exhibited progressive loss of speech and was only able after a while to produce routinely and precisely the word Dan. What is your name? Dan. What have you had for breakfast? Dan. For which reason the patient was later nicknamed Dan. Now, interestingly enough, the patient exhibited no problems with comprehension. The only thing that seemed to be impaired was the ability to produce speech consistently and well enough to be understood. So the patient was non-fluent despite exhibiting intact comprehension, and all other mental attributes or faculties seem to be unimpaired. Memory, perception, decision making. So this is quite curious, and that motivated Broca to take a very close look at Dan's brain upon death. And what the autopsy revealed was a very precisely localized damage to a part of the left frontal lobe, which later came to be called Broca's area. Now, you might wonder whether, based on a single example, we should jump to the conclusion that this area is responsible for speech production. And indeed, Broca wondered the same thing. So he carefully studied this in many other individuals who happen to exhibit the same or similar problems with speech production. And upon presenting his results, his findings, the science community was quite blown away. This was no longer phrenology. This was not the study of bumps being associated with traits of character. This was a very precise and objective study of brain damage and its very specific impact on behavior, in this case, speech production. What was even more interesting to many anthropologists, for instance, was the fact that this individual had intact comprehension. So the question was quite obvious. Is it possible to encounter other patients that exhibit the reverse pattern of results? So damaged comprehension, impaired comprehension, or with normal fluency, normal speech production. And it was Karl Wernicke in the 1800s who had the opportunity to look at 6 such individuals with impaired comprehension despite fluent output. These individuals could talk and could talk quite a lot. And he identified a portion in a different part of the brain, in the left temporal lobe, which obviously became later known as Wernicke's area. So what we've got here are 2 different parts of the brain that seem to mediate different parts of language processing. One responsible for comprehension, one responsible for speech production. So language is not a unique mental faculty. It is rather distributed across different parts of the brain. And this is very interesting if you care about the study of language. But clearly, this speaks to much more than just language. This is a very clear instantiation, a very clear illustration of the idea of localization of function. So can we find equally compelling cases of function localization for other types of abilities, let's say movement? John Jackson is responsible for a major discovery in this sense. John Jackson was interested in seizures, abnormal electrical activity in different parts of the human cortex. And in particular, Jackson cared about the monocortex, a part of the frontal lobe, which is responsible for controlling movement. What Jackson noted was that when seizures happen and are related to the dysfunctions of motor cortex, there is a certain progression to how our body reacts to that. Typically, seizures to the motor cortex have as a very visible impact tremor or uncontrollable shaking of different body parts. So in some cases, let's say that one finger moves uncontrollably due to seizure. Then, as the condition worsens, the next thing that happens is that the next finger is impacted, and then the next finger, and then the arm, and so on and so forth. So there is a certain progression to which there is a certain pattern to how the condition develops, and this is surprisingly consistent in how it develops. What does this mean? Presumably, it means that the cortical areas responsible for different body parts are organized in a systematic manner, and more importantly that we do have cortical areas responsible for, let's say, the thumb and then the index finger and then the ring finger and so on and so forth. And as the condition of a patient worsens, it is because each one of these areas are impacted based on their vicinity. And our knowledge of cortical organization nowadays definitely confirms this hypothesis. Considerably expanding on these findings was Wilder Penfield, once known as the greatest living Canadian. In Montreal, he developed what later was called the Montreal procedure for the treatment of epilepsy. What Penfield cared about was seizures and epilepsy. He was a neurosurgeon, and he took particular interest in the right way to use surgical procedures in the treating of epilepsy. As some of you might know, even to this day, in cases of intractable epilepsy where no pharmacological solution can be found, eventually the part of the brain which is responsible for producing the seizures may need to be removed via neurosurgery. So Penfield developed his own technique for observing the parts of the brain responsible for the seizure and for removing them. But in the process of doing so, in the process of removing the skull, exposing the brain, and trying to identify the part of the brain responsible for an epileptic seizure, he also had to do something else. He had to pay very careful attention to not removing parts of the brain which are essential to somebody's well-functioning. And to do that, he used electrocortical stimulation. He applied small electrical current to different parts of the brain. And then he could test the reaction of the awake subject to such stimulation. And upon doing so, he managed to describe very different reactions depending on the site of the stimulation. If the stimulation occurs, let's say, within the occipital cortex, then that might lead to visual hallucinations. If it occurs within the temporal cortex, you might be able to, let's say, unlock a new memory, and so on and so forth. And this is a very powerful demonstration because we're moving away simply from observations of brain damage and relationship to cognition. Here we establish a causal link between neural activity and cognitive functioning and behavior. Now, Penfield cared a lot about the temporal cortex and about movement, and his contribution especially to the organization of motor cortex. However, the general contribution to localization of function from the standpoint of his research are tremendous. Now, when Penfield stimulated the prefrontal cortex as opposed to occipital cortex or motor cortex or temporal cortex, nothing really seemed to happen, hence the label silent cortex. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that prefrontal cortex is not responsible for some core functions or abilities. And some older piece of medical observation comes into play here, and perhaps one of the most widely popular and disputed to this day in neuroscience. This is the case of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker from the 1800s, who suffered brain damage as a result of a bar passing through his skull and his brain behind his eye and destroying parts of prefrontal cortex, especially a portion of prefrontal cortex known as orbitofrontal cortex. Surprisingly, both to his colleagues and to the medical world at the time, he made a surprising recovery. He was able to survive it, and in many ways he was the same. Yet over time he seemed to suffer from changes in personality, in the way in which he experienced emotion, to such an extent that his doctor decided that Gage is no longer Gage. Hence, for a long time, it was believed that orbitofrontal cortex is responsible for emotion and personality. So again, much of the actual research surrounding Phineas Gage is under dispute. However, the idea that the prefrontal cortex is also responsible for hosting a specific faculty or mental attribute is important for our lecture. Moving on to a much more recent case, that of patient HM. This is an individual who suffered from debilitating epilepsy as a result of brain injury. Now, his doctors identify the bilateral medial temporal lobe as responsible for the abnormal electrical activity that induces seizures in epileptic patients. Hence, they rushed to remove surgically the temporal lobe in both hemispheres. And here you can see displayed the large portions of cortex that have been removed from patient HM relative to how they should look like in a normal brain. Now, this was successful in the way that it stopped epileptic seizures. Unfortunately for HM, though, this had the impact of a rather interesting inability. The inability to form new memories after the surgical procedures. And the technical term for that is anterograde amnesia. His doctors understood that the medial temporal lobe was responsible for the seizures, but they failed to fully appreciate the importance of some medial temporal lobe structures for memory processing and for memory formation. Last but not least, callosotomy was a very interesting case. This was also a way of treating epileptic disorders, seizures, by way of removing the corpus callosum, the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres with each other. And the reason this was done was because seizures often travel from one part of the brain to the other. So by resectioning the corpus callosum, we are in a position to control the intensity of the seizures, to limit the number of cortical areas that it impacts. Interestingly enough, while this was saluted as a contribution to the treatment of epilepsy, it was not immediately clear what impact it has on behavior and on cognitive functioning. However, Roger Spey, along with his graduate student at the time, Mike Gazzaniga, who happens to be the author of our textbook, devised a clever series of tests that focused on such individuals, on split brain patients, and try to uncover the macro organization of the brain in terms of cortical, or rather hemispheric lateralization. What does one hemisphere do that the other cannot? And first of all, he established that to a large extent there is correspondence, right? Bilateral areas tend to commit to the same type of process, but this is not entirely correct. He also came to the realization that the left hemisphere typically is a lot more involved in language processing than the right hemisphere. So what that means is that localization of function is not entirely a discussion about small, tiny parts of cortical areas, but we can talk about localization of function even in the case of an entire brain hemisphere. And for this research, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Now, the localization of function has critical implications for how we think of cognition and the brain. And some of those implications are quite practical. Unfortunately, there are also instances where localization of function was misapplied and misguided. And this is very much the case of lobotomy or leucotomy. These are interchangeable terms. At some point in the 19th century and the 20th century, asylums became filled with individuals suffering from a mental illness at a time in which the world did not know what to make of them, how to explain mental illness, how to treat it, what attitude to take towards it. And it became apparent that the prefrontal cortex might have something to do with personality and behavior. Let's say violent behavior in a patient suffering from mental illness. Hence, neurosurgeons rushed into the possibility of controlling mental illness and its effect by cutting off the connection between prefrontal cortex and the rest of the human brain. And Gottlieb Burckhardt, a Swiss neurosurgeon, is credited to performing the first such treatment in 6 patients with unclear mixed results, based upon which he did not proceed with that practice any longer. However, Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurosurgeon, developed another version of the procedure with which he claimed to have had success in non-human primates that exhibited violent behavior, uncontrolled behavior, and which upon undergoing frontal leucotomy became much more docile. Based on the success of his work with primates, Egas Moniz continued that work with humans, for which he claimed to have obtained somewhat similar results. His revolutionary work at the time garnered him a Nobel Prize in Medicine, and his work was saluted by the medical community. But perhaps the worst instance is that of Walter Freeman, an American neurosurgeon who developed yet another version of the frontal lobotomy, the so-called transorbital lobotomy, due to the fact that he severed the connection of parts of frontal cortex to the rest of the brain by drilling not into the skull but through the eye. Walter Freeman applied his procedure not to several patients or several dozens, but to tens of thousands of patients, with dire consequences. Some of the patients died. Those he operated on exhibited a variety of impairments that most certainly impacted their well-being, and failed to reveal the gravity of the situation. He continued to pursue in advocating and exploring his practice even when the science argued very clearly against him. Unfortunately, the medical community was very slow to catch up with it, and because of that, to this day, Walter Freeman is known to have conducted one of the most is known to be responsible for one of the most unfortunate turns of events in scientific research. Of course, ultimately, both he as a scientist and his practice became discredited. Now, to be clear about it, this does not speak to the value or the utility of neurosurgery. In many cases, to this day, neurosurgery is necessary to ensure survival, or at the very least the well-being of a patient. Rather, what we're trying to demonstrate here, to illustrate, is a misapplication of neurosurgery as related to a core concept in neuroscience, that of localization of function. Now, science might have its villains, but it definitely has its heroes as well. And to many, Alexander Luria is perhaps one such hero. That's because of the way in which he treated patients. He treated patients not just as cases or case numbers, but as humans, as people that need to be not just observed, but also carefully interacted with. And this was also well aligned with his whole person view of brain injury. If you're trying to figure out what happens as a result of brain injury, then you should get a complete picture of how that impacts somebody's life, somebody's behavior. And in that view, he was heavily influenced, for those who care about developmental psychology, by Vygotsky. However, this also has deeper theoretical implications for localization of functions. And that's not something that he dismissed or not took seriously. Luria agreed with the importance of function localization, but at the same time, he articulated a complementary idea, the idea of hierarchical brain organization. It is true that there is value in studying different parts of the brain and their ability to support different functions, different cognitive functions. This is a divide and conquer strategy. But that does not necessarily mean that we are entitled to talk about a language area or a unique memory area. Rather, we should talk about networks. It is a lot more likely that the brain is capable of performing a certain function because it relies on a complex network of multiple areas working in consonance with each other. Hence, Luria pushed the field towards exploring the organization of cortical networks as opposed to simply dissecting independently, separately, the profile of different areas. And furthermore, he pushed the field to study how injury within one given area perturbs the functioning of an entire network that comprises that area. Luria is also responsible for the first comprehensive volume of neuropsychology. And I should mention this, cognitive neuropsychology is an important field with which we have already come in touch during this lecture that concerns the study of brain injury and its impact on cognitive function. And this brings me to the last point of discussion for today, and this is a point upon which I touched on before. It is the necessity of merging cognitive psychology and neuroscience in a domain with its own identity. What does cognitive psychology do? What have we learned about cognitive psychology so far that it does? Well, it provides us with descriptions, with models, with theories that characterize, let's say, stages of information processing. And these models are informed by behavioral analysis in particular, but not only. Nowadays, numerical computational simulations are as much a tool afforded to us by the cognitive revolution in the 60s as behavior is. However, there are limits that we can reach when utilizing the tools of cognitive psychology. At some point, the evidence that behavior yields for us under constrains the theories. It fails to arbitrate between competing theories. Hence, there is necessity and value in looking at the brain and trying to discriminate between those hypotheses. The use of neuroscientific evidence is there not just for the purpose of providing additional evidence for some theories, but in many cases to provide decisive evidence for one theory versus another. And there are many methods, tools, and techniques that allow neuroscience to bring to bear on the theories of cognitive psychology. And we will have the opportunity to chat about those methods and techniques and their implications on the field as a whole in the coming weeks.